our speaker tonight is the author Yiyun Li. She comes to us most recently from UC Davis, where she teaches writing in the English program there. But she has made several other much longer journeys, which I suppose we're all in the middle of all our journeys, right? So none of them are completed. For example, her journey from immunology to fiction writing, or her journey from China to America. So we're particularly happy to have her here to speak to us about this moment or this time in these journeys she's been taking. She is the author of 2 collections of short stories and 2 novels, as well as this most recent work, Dear Friend, From My Life I Write to You in Your Life, which perplexes people in bookstores who want to know where to put it. It's perhaps memoir, perhaps something else. And all of these have been very highly acclaimed. The journey, I think, that is most interesting to us, I think many people in this room will have been on a journey or are in a journey which somehow parallels some of the journeys that Yiyun Li has taken. Many people in this room have taken a similar geographic or linguistic or cultural journey. And so I think that her talk will be interesting to you, but what I want to say is that in her writing, and so perhaps tonight in her talk, you may find that some of what she says is jarring, is unexpected, it's always thought-provoking, and it's always crafted with great precision. She has won many awards, and I could list them. Penn Hemingway Award, MacArthur Foundation Fellowship, etc. But better than telling you all of those awards, I would say this to you. She's here tonight, so let's listen, and let's talk to her, and ask questions. And then tomorrow, go find something of hers to read. So thank you.
Thank you, Robert. I give the lecture's title called "To Speak is to Blunder, but I Venture," which is a chapter's title in the book. But when it was printed in the New Yorker, they ran out of space. They couldn't put a second half of the title, so they used the title "To Speak is to Blunder," which to me sounds Chinese. You know, it sounds very much like Zen. The moment you open your mouth, you're blundering. But I really want to emphasize I have the second half. To speak is to blunder, but I venture. I did open my mouth and I started talking. So I'm going to start reading this essay. To speak is to blunder, but I venture. In a dream the other night, I was back in Beijing at the entrance of my family's apartment complex, where a public telephone, a black rotary, had once been guarded by the old women from the neighborhood association. They used to listen without hiding their disdain or curiosity while I was on the phone with friends. When I finished, they would complain about the length of the conversation before logging it into their book and calculating the charge. In those days, I accumulated many errands before I went to use the telephone, lest my parents notice my extended absence. My allowance, which was what I could scrimp and save from my lunch money, was spent on phone calls and stamps and envelopes. Like a character in a Victorian novel, I checked our mail before my parents did, and collected letters to me from friends before my parents could intercept them. In my dream, I asked for the phone. 2 women came out of the front office. I recognized them. In real life, they are both gone. No, they said. The service is no longer offered because everyone has a cell phone these days. There was nothing extraordinary about the dream. A melancholy visit to the past in this manner is beyond one's control. But for the fact that the women spoke to me in English. Years ago, when I started writing in English, my husband asked if I understood the implication of the decision. What he meant was not the practical concerns, though there were plenty. The nebulous hope of getting published, the lack of a career path as had been laid out in science, my first field of postgraduate study in America, the harsher immigration regulation. Many of my college classmates from China, as scientists, acquired their green cards under a national interest waiver. An artist is not much of importance to any nation. My husband, who writes computer programs, was asking about language. Did I understand what it meant to renounce my mother tongue? Nabokov once answered a question he must have been tired of being asked. My private tragedy, which cannot, indeed should not, be anyone's concern, is that I had to abandon my natural language, my natural idiom. That something is called a tragedy, however, means it is no longer personal. One weeps out of private pain, but only when the audience swarms in and claims understanding and empathy do people call it a tragedy. One's grief belongs to oneself, one's tragedy to others. I often feel a tinge of guilt when I imagine Nabokov's role. Like all intimacies, the intimacy between one and one's mother tongue can be comforting and irreplaceable. Yet it can also demand more than what one is willing to give, or more than one is capable of giving. If I allowed myself to be honest, my private salvation, which cannot and should not be anybody's concern, is that I disowned my native language. That's the first part. I think it's hard when you come out and say I disowned my mother tongue, because it's such a loaded word, mother tongue, motherland, mother. So I want to play a song, a short song by Dvorak. The song's title is Songs My Mother Taught Me.
Songs
That's the song called Songs of My Mother Taught Me, Antonin Dvorak. The lyrics go like this. Songs my mother taught me, in the days long vanished, seldom from her eyelids were the teardrops banished. Now I teach my children each melodious measure. Often the tears are flowing, often they flow from my memory's treasure. I mention the sound, for several reasons. One is it's a story for every generation. It's a story for all nationalities. We used to have a babysitter who was this lovely young woman. She would sing these Irish songs to my children that she actually did not understand the words. And she said she sang the songs because her mother used to sing these Irish songs to her. But her mother also did not understand the words. Her mother memorized the songs from her mother. And in every generation, we want to sing the songs to our children. But I actually realized when I was listening to the Dvorak's recording the other day, I realized I have never sung songs to my children. And for a very specific reason, I'm going to read a little part from the book. My mother, who loves to sing, often sings the songs from her childhood and youth, many of them propagandas from 1950s and 1960s. But there's one song she reminisces all her life because she doesn't know how to sing it. She learned the song in kindergarten, the year communism took over her hometown. She can only remember the opening line. I grew up listening to her talking about, this song started with description of an ant, and that's it. And then she would sing the first line, and then she would say, I don't remember. And I thought the songs we don't sing to our children, that's probably more interesting. Sometimes. The reason I also hesitate to sing the songs to my children, I grew up really in the propaganda songs. I actually oftentimes move myself to tears when I sing them. One time I was driving through Texas. It was a long drive through the whole state. I was by myself. I was very bored, and I tried to keep myself awake. So I started to sing all the communist songs, starting from kindergarten until I was, a young person. And every song really moved me. And I was in tears, and I thought, even propagandas can move people into this state. But I don't think I can give those songs to my children, so I've never done that. And I'm going to read, and it's not only about song, it's not only about singing, it's the language used in those songs. So I'm going to read the next passage. People often ask about my decision to write in English. The switch from one language to another feels natural to me, I reply. Though that does not say much, just as one can hardly give a convincing explanation as to why someone's hair turns gray on one day, but not on another. But this is an inane analogy, I realize, because I do not want to touch the heart of the matter. Yes, there is something unnatural, which I have refused to accept. Not the fact of writing in a second language. There are always Nabokov and Conrad as references, and many of my contemporaries as well, or that I impulsively give up a reliable career for writing. It's the absoluteness of my abandoning of Chinese, undertaken with such determination, that it is a kind of suicide. The tragedy of Nabokov's loss is that his misfortune was easily explained by public history. His story of being driven by a revolution into permanent exile became the possession of other people. My decision to write in English has also been explained as a flight from my country's history. But unlike Nabokov, who had been a published Russian writer, I never wrote in Chinese. Still, one cannot avoid the fact that a private decision once seen through a public prism, becomes a metaphor. Once a poet of East European origin and I, we both have lived in America for years and both write in English. We're asked to read our work in our native language at a gala. But I don't write in Chinese, I explained. And the organizer apologized for her misunderstanding. I offered to read Li Po or Du Fu, or any of the Asian poets I'd grown up memorizing. But instead, it was arranged for me to read poetry by a political prisoner. A metaphor's desire to transcend diminishes any human story. Its ambition to illuminate blinds those who create metaphors. In my distrust of metaphors, I feel a kinship with George Eliot. We, all of us, grave or light, get our thoughts entangled in metaphors and act fatally on the strengths of them. My abandonment of my first language is personal, so deeply personal that I resist any interpretation, political or historical or ethnographical. This, I know, is what my husband was questioning years ago. Was I prepared to be turned into a symbol by well-intentioned or hostile minds? Chinese immigrants of my generation in America sometimes criticize my English for not being native enough. A compatriot, after reading my work, pointed out in an email how my language is neither lavish nor lyrical, as a real writer's language should be. You write only simple things in simple English. You should be ashamed of yourself, he wrote in a fury. A professor, an American writer in grad school, told me that I should stop writing, as English would remain a foreign language to me. Their concerns about ownership of a language, rather than making me as impatient as Nabokov, allow me secret laughter. English is to me as random a choice as any other language. What one goes towards is less definitive than that from which one turns away. So I think a lot of people question my being or not being a political writer. Once at a bookstore, this is my local bookstore, really my neighborhood bookstore, I was giving a reading, and a woman came in and she said, "Your father was a nuclear physicist. My father was a nuclear physicist too. Did you grow up in this complex?" I said, "Oh, yes, I did." And she said, I want you to know I'm not happy with you because I want to be proud of China, and you're not writing to make me being proud of my being a Chinese." And I was a little surprised because if I write about America, I would not make any people feel like proud of being American either. And then afterwards, it's a very Chinese story. She came to me. The first question she asked me was, "What's your father's name?" And I said, "What's your father's name?" And I realized when we met in that bookstore, we were all of a sudden going back to that Chinese moment. We were determined or defined by who the fathers were. But on the other hand, I give another reading in Asia Society in San Francisco, and there's this young American, very lovely American man, and he was also furious for another reason. He lived in China for years. And he said, I can't understand why you refuse to be a political writer. You're not writing politically. And I thought, that's an interesting concern. And I just want to read one part. This is such a political moment in China. And if you are a Chinese writer, if you're Chinese coming from China, from my generation, always people would ask about Tiananmen Square massacre. And so I'm going to read this journal entry in June 2014. This was 25 years of Tiananmen massacre. June 2014. When I'm writing today, the world is inundated with images of and opinions on Tiananmen Square massacre from 25 years ago. Everything seems to be said with certainty. People, especially those watching a tragedy from afar, talk with such eloquence. I cannot help but suspect a similarity to Mann's arrogance. This is Thomas Mann commenting on Stefan Zweig's suicide. When people express strong feelings about what they may not understand, the story becomes about themselves. Yet if these output, anger, grief, idolization, and idealization of a historical event, full of discrepancies, untrustworthy characters, calculating on both sides with people's lives as betting chips, farces even, were the only meaningful narratives to the public, life would be a less interesting business, literature a less worthwhile pursuit. When I was reading the news earlier, a random memory, which I had forgotten, hit me. My sister was in medical school then and went with her classmates to Tiananmen Square to help the students on hunger strike. From one of the visits, she brought back a sun hat for me. Made of thin white muslin and shaped like a Victoria bonnet, it was called Jane Eyre hat in the 1980s in China. I had always wanted a Jane Eyre hat when I was little. After the massacre, the hat vanished. No doubt my father, who went to the hospital to count bodies, was the one to have purged it. It was a donated item to the protest, and it might incriminate my sister. To make sense of the Jane Eyre hat, I would have to go through decades of history. I would have to intrude into other people's past. Nevertheless, it would be a futile effort. I could parse tragedy and comedy on all levels, national and familiar and personal. Yet the Jane Eyre hat would remain elusive. I would never be able to explain why its memory made me weep. Certainly, I see another possibility. That flimsy object could be turned into something more than it was, a symbol or a metaphor. In the meantime, it would become much less than what it was. So I think that's always my thinking is you can't explain a historical moment or political moment in a simple way. And when I was writing the book, I thought, I'm just going to explain this one thought is you cannot ask me to. I got so upset on that day because I got all these interviews and radio stations and TVs they would call in. What they really wanted was not a human story. What they really wanted was some sort of statement. And I don't think I'm interested in giving these statements, which is why I refuse to be a political writer. And I think I have that line in my book. I have spent much of my life turning away from the script given to me in China and in America. My refusal to be defined by others' wills is my one and only political statement. I think it's hard to say, I don't want to say what you want me to say, but one almost always has to do that to be true to oneself. So I'm going to read the next part. Running away. Oh yes, I need to tell this story. My older son, he's 15, and I think young people's anxiety dreams are most fascinating. So he woke up the other day, he said, I had a nightmare. I said, what was your nightmare? He said, I dreamed that I was a negative number. He said, I couldn't figure out my square root. And I said, I just laughed. I thought, that's a great metaphorical dream. And then he said, the imagined number in the mass, he said, well, I had such a hard time in my dream because all those troublesome problems with the I. And I said, I'm going to borrow your story. And I asked his permission. You always have to ask a teenager's permission. And then he agreed for me to share. Because a lot of what we do, it has to do with that troublesome I. One crosses the border to become a new person. One finishes a manuscript and cuts off the characters. One adopts a language. These are false and forced frameworks, providing illusory freedom. At times, provides illusionary leniency when we, in anguish, let it pass monotonously. To kill time, an English phrase that still chills me. Time can be killed. No one thinks of suicide as a courageous endeavor to kill time. I want to frame that the book was written after a series of events, including hospitalization. So it's all in the book, and I don't feel it's okay for me to talk about it. So during my second hospital stay in New York, a group of nursing students came to play bingo one Friday night. A young woman, another patient, asked if I would join her. Bingo, I said. I've never in my life played that. She pondered for a moment and said that she had played bingo only in the hospital. It was her 8th hospitalization when I met her. She had taken middle school courses for a while in the hospital when she was younger. And once she pointed out a small patch of fenced-in green where she and other children had been let out for exercise. Her father often visited her in the afternoon, and I would watch them sitting together playing a game, not attempting a conversation. By then, all words must have been inadequate, language doing little to help a mind survive time. Yet language is capable of sinking a mind. One's thoughts are slavishly bound to language. I used to think that an abyss is a moment of despair, becoming interminable. But any moment, even the direst, is bound to end. What's abysmal is that one's erratic language closes in like quicksand. We can kill time, but language kills us. So, running away, I think it's running away from that language that kills us. However, we all remember, maybe some of you know that story in Zhuangzi, the man who is afraid of his shadow. So he needs to run away from his shadow. The faster he runs, the faster the shadow catches on. And for each step, the shadow follows. Until, I think in one version I read, actually it was a version for children when I was little, until he felt so tired he had to take a rest under a tree. Yes, the shadow was gone. You just need to find that magic tree. But I think that shadow that we run away from, each person has a different shadow. For me, it's the word I, as my child says, the troublesome I. A word I hate to use in English is I. It's a melodramatic word, though one's effort to avoid it only goes so far. In Chinese, a language less grammatically strict, one can construct a sentence with an implied subject pronoun and skip the embarrassing I, or else replace it with we. When I came to America, people say Americans don't have that we voice. America is a country of individualism, so we all have to stand up and say I. And I think this is a personal thing. I still don't feel comfortable saying I. However, I also notice, I think, maybe we have all noticed that lately that word we is coming to America. More and more, everybody is using that. I had a student from Iran years ago, and when I was telling her, I said, in China, oftentimes we don't say I. You just skip that I, or you sometimes say we, even if you are yourself. And she said, oh, it was the same. It was exactly the same in Iran. She said, the reason we don't say I is we try to avoid responsibility. We don't want to be caught. And I think that's interesting. Yes. So I came from Chinese to English, thinking I could run away from my mother tongue, thinking I could abandon my mother tongue, and thinking I could take up a new language to become a new person. But I will say, it's probably not a good idea to think that way. So this is the opening chapter, opening paragraphs of the book. My first encounter with before and after was in one of the fashion magazines my friends told me to subscribe when I came to America. I duly followed their advice. I had an anthropologist's fascination with America then. I had never seen a glossy magazine, and the quality of the paper and the printing, not to mention the trove of perfumes waiting to be unfolded, made me wonder how the economy worked for the magazine to make a profit, considering I paid no more than $1 for an issue. My favorite column was on the last page of the magazine, and it featured celebrity makeovers, hairstyle and hair color, for instance, with 2 bubbles signifying before and after. I didn't often have an opinion about the transformation, but I liked the definitiveness of that phrase, before and after, with nothing muddling the in-between. After years of living in America, I still feel a momentary elation when I see an advertisement for weight loss programs, teeth whitening strips, hair loss treatments, or even plastic surgery, with the contrasting effects shown under before and after. The certainty in that pronouncement, for each unfortunate or inconvenient situation, there is a solution to make it no longer be, both attracts and perplexes me. Life can be reset, it seems to say, time can be separated. But that logic appears to me as doubtful as traveling to another place to become a different person. Altered sceneries are at best distractions, or else new settings for old habits. What one carries from one point to another, geographically or temporally, is one's self. Even the most inconsistent person is consistently himself. I was teaching the other day, and this is undergrad creative writing class, and one student said, well, I think for each story, something has to happen, and something has to change, and from the beginning to the end, the character has to change by the end. I mean, we hear these conversations in creative writing classes, and I was a little surprised. I said, in fact, I think it's an American idea. It's a very American idea that we're going to have a before and after. By the end of the story, something is going to change. There's a narrative arc. And I said, well, actually, life is not lived by arc. We don't have a narrative arc in life. And in fact, I said to my student, I said, if you live long enough like me, I said, you will understand people don't change. People are only becoming themselves more and more. And I think that's the danger of before and after, because there's really no before and after, and there's only this now we're living. And so I like what Robin said, we're on a journey. That journey is always ongoing. We're not going to transform in any way. So I'm going to skip one page. Well, actually, I can't skip this. This is about language, so I'm going to talk a little bit more about language because I talked about changing to English. So when I was having a hard time, I I was in a bookstore and I run into this copy of Catherine Mansfield's notebooks. She kept years of notebooks and very detailed account of her life, including what she spent on stamps, letter papers, and telegrams, all these little things. Boot polish for her husband. I love that. Curtain, seamstress fees, all these things going on. So I really love that book. And for a while, I was reading that book mostly because I had a hard time and I was just reading her to distract myself. When Catherine Mansfield was still a teenager, she wrote in her journal about a man next door playing Swanee River on a cornet for what seemed like weeks. I wake up with the Swanee River, eat it with every meal I take, and go to bed eventually with all the world I am sad and weary as lullaby. I read Mansfield's notebooks and Marianne Moore's letters, so this is another writer I've been reading around the time, and Marianne Moore's letters around the same time, when I returned home from New York. In the letter, Moore described a night of fundraising at Bryn Mawr, maidens in bathing suits and green bathing tails on a raft. It was really most realistic, way down upon the Swanee River. I marked the entries because they reminded me of a moment I had forgotten. I was 9, and my sister 13. On a Saturday afternoon, I was in our apartment, and she was on the balcony. My sister had joined the middle school choir that year, and in the autumn sunshine, she sang in a voice that was beginning to leave girlhood. Way down upon the Swanee River, far, far away, that's where my heart is turning ever. That's where the old folks stay. The lyrics were translated into Chinese. The memory, too, should be in Chinese. But I cannot see our tiny garden with the grapevine, which our father cultivated and which was later uprooted by our wrathful mother, or the bamboo fence dotted with morning glories, or the junk that occupied half the balcony, if I do not name these things to myself in English. I cannot see my sister, but I can hear her sing the lyrics in English. I can seek to understand my mother's vulnerability and cruelty, but language is the barrier I have chosen. Over the years, my brain has banished Chinese. I dream in English. I talk to myself in English. And memories, not only those about America, but also those about China, not only those carried away with me, but also those archived with the wish to forget, are sorted in English. To be orphaned from my native language felt, and still feels, like a crucial decision. When you say you're orphaned from your language, from your mother language, that also means a lot. You're orphaned from your motherland. But I think for some of us, when I say for some of us, including some of the writers I have written in the book, including Marianne Moore, I think to go to extreme is a way to survive. And I'm going to read, so we talk a little bit about my science background, and I really love, when I was in the science, I was doing experiment on little mice, and I was studying asthma. So I would put ragweed, I would inject ragweed to induce these asthma reaction from the mice. And I would put into the glass chamber and measure their breathing pattern and look at everything, including the dissection. The one thing we could not see is how much they suffer. And I realized suffering is not measurable scientifically. And asthma, the word asthma is from Latin. It means panting. But in ancient Rome, the doctors nicknamed asthma rehearsing death, which means when you are panting, you're rehearsing how to die. You're rehearsing how to draw your last breath. And I thought, that's an interesting concept, because we have, if you look at literature, we have literature about writers and artists who have mental illnesses or who have drinking problems. But nobody has ever looked at artists who have asthma. And the list could go on forever. If you do study asthma, a lot of artists, they have asthma. And you realize what they do in their art, in a way, either to write or to paint or to play music. It's a way to rehearse death. And I came to this country as an aspiring immunologist. This is what I love about immunology. I had chosen the field if one does not count the practical motives of wanting a reason to leave China and having a skill to make a living, because I had lacked the working concept of the immune system. Its job is to detect and attack non-self. It has memories, some as long-lasting as life. Its memories can go awry, selectively, or worse, indiscriminately, leading the system to mistake self as foreign, as something to eliminate. The word immune, from the Latin immunus, in plus munius, service, obligation, is among my favorite in the English language. The possession of immunity to illness, to follies, to love and loneliness and troubling thoughts and unalleviated pains. A trait that I have desired for my characters and myself, knowing all the same the futility of such a wish. Only the lifeless can be immune to life. So there's really no immunity. But for a while I thought I could be immune to life by not writing about my life. And once I was in Beijing, of course this happened in Beijing, someone asked, "Are you an autobiographical writer?" I said, no, I'm not, never. And she said, "I noticed in two stories, your father, in two of your stories, the father was a nuclear physicist, and your own father is a nuclear physicist too. Why are you not an autobiographical writer?" And I said, that's laziness on my part. But I think if any writer says, "I'm not an autobiographical writer," or if anyone says it as strongly as I do, I think you should always suspect there's something wrong with that. There's always a lie somewhere. So the reason I would say a little bit, one cannot be an adept writer of one's own life tales. One can hardly be a discerning reader of that tale. Not equipped with the novelist tools to create plots and maneuver pacing, to speak omnisciently, or abandon an inconvenient point of view for another, to tweak the linearity of time and splice the less connected moments. The most interesting people among us, I often suspect, are flatter than the flattest characters in the novel. Not only do we not have alternatives, we discredit them. We convince ourselves that the alternatives are not ours in the first place. It has to be so. This indisputable conviction is often at the foundation of our decisions, including the most impulsive or the most catastrophic. It is easier to be certain of one thing than to be uncertain of 100, easier to be one than many have-beens. And I think that's when I said I was not an autobiographical writer, I feel that with this book I'm coming out of the closet in a way and saying, yes, what you don't tell, what you withhold from people is equally important as what you do tell in the book. And I think the case in point is Marianne Moore, who was not an autobiographical poet. And if you read her poetry, you could not detect any self in her poetry. And if you read her letters, you could hardly detect anything. But I think with all these things we've held in her, I mean, she had really, to me, she became an autobiographical writer. She had a very controlling mother. I think it's an interesting, she's an interesting case because she had a controlling mother, and the mother lived with her all her life, and the mother never left her for a moment. not only the mother read her poetry, would edit her, would not only did the mother read her, and the mother would scrutinize her body every day. And just imagine living with that mother. And one time, they got a little kitten, and they named the kitten Buffalo. And Marianne Moore was in love with that buffalo, the little kitten. And when she was working in the library, her mother brought a jar of ether and killed the kitten because of her love for that kitten. And even that, she wrote in a letter, she said, well, she broke my heart, but she had to do so. I understand she had to do so. And I thought, well, that's the mother, or that's the mother language, or that motherland, that mother that we have to escape. But not everybody could escape. When we enter a world, a new country, a new school, a party, a family or a class reunion, an army's camp, a hospital, we speak the language it requires. The wisdom to adapt is the wisdom to have two languages, the one spoken to others and the one spoken to oneself. One learns to master the public language, not much differently from the way that one acquires a second language. Assess the situation, construct sentences with the right words and the correct syntax, catch a mistake if one can avoid it, or else apologize and learn the lesson after a blunder. Fluency in the public language, like fluency in a second language, can be achieved with enough practice. Perhaps the line between the two is and should never be fluid. Perhaps the line between the two is and should be fluid. It is never so for me. I often forget when I write that English is also used by others. English is my private language. Every word has to be pondered before it becomes a word. I have no doubt, can this be an illusion, that the conversation I have with myself, however linguistically flawed, is the conversation that I have always wanted, in the exact way I want it to be. In my relationship with English, in this relationship with the intrinsic distance between a non-native speaker and an adopted language that makes people look askance, I feel invisible, but not estranged. It is the position I believe I always want in life, but with every pursuit, there is the danger of crossing a line from invisibility to erasure. There was a time when I could write well in Chinese. In school, my essays were used as models. In the army, where I spent a year of involuntary service, our squad leader gave me the choice between drafting speech for her and cleaning the toilet of the pigsties. I always chose to write. Once in high school, I entered an oratory contest. On stage, I saw that many of my listeners were moved to tears by the poetic and insincere lies I had made up. I moved myself to tears too. It crossed my mind that I could become a successful propaganda writer. I was disturbed by this. A young person wants to be true to herself and to the world. But it did not occur to me to ask, can one's intelligence rely entirely on the public language? Can one form a precise thought, record an accurate memory, or even feel a genuine feeling with only the public language? I actually forgot that my squad leader now teaches at Cornell. She's a physicist here. Isn't that interesting? I didn't tell her I was coming because it's hard to encounter another past. That's very cowardly of me. When one thinks in an adopted language, one arranges and rearranges words that are neutral, indifferent even. When one remembers in an adopted language, there's a dividing line in that remembrance. What came before could be someone else's life. It might as well be fiction. What language, I wonder, does one use to feel? Or does one need a language to feel? In a hospital in New York, one of my doctors asked me to visit a class studying minds and brains. 2 medical students interviewed me, following a script. The doctor who led the class, impatient with their tentativeness, sent them back to the seat and posed questions more pointed and unrelenting. To answer him, I had to navigate my thoughts, and I watched him and his students closely, as I was being watched. When he asked about feelings, I said it was beyond my ability to describe what might as well be indescribable. If you can be articulate about your thoughts, why can't you articulate your feelings? The doctor said. It took me a year to figure out the answer. It is hard to feel in an adopted language, yet it is impossible in my native language. Often I think writing is a futile effort. So is reading. So is living. Loneliness is the inability to speak with another in one's private language. That emptiness is filled with public language or romanticized connections. After the dream of public telephone, I remembered a moment in the army. It was New Year's Eve, and we were ordered to watch the official celebration on CCTV. Halfway through the program, a girl on duty came and said there was a long-distance call for me. It was the same type of black rotary phone as we had back at the apartment, and my sister was on the line. It was the first long-distance call I had received in my life, and the next time would be 4 years later back in Beijing, when an American professor phoned to interview me. I still remember the woman calling from Mount Sinai Hospital in New York City, asking questions about my interest in immunology, talking about her research project and life in America. My English was good enough to understand half of what she said, and the scratching noises in the background made me sweat for the missed half. What did my sister and I talk about on that New Year's Eve? In abandoning my native language, I have erased myself from the memory. But erasing, I have learned, does not stop with a new language. And that, my friend, is my sorrow and my selfishness. In speaking and in writing in an adopted language, I have not stopped erasing. I have crossed the line too, from erasing myself to erasing others. I'm not the only casualty in this war against myself. In an ideal world, I would prefer to have my mind reserved for thinking, and thinking alone. I dread the moment when a thought trails off and a feeling starts, when one faces the eternal challenge of eluding the void for which one does not have words. To speak when one cannot is to blunder. I have spoken by having written this book or any book, for myself and against myself. The solace is with the language I chose, the grief to have spoken at all. That's the end of the reading. I'm sorry, it's so sad. I must tell you a joke so you don't feel so sad. So when Rebecca West was young, she went to, this has nothing to do with me. Rebecca West was young, and H.G. Wells took Rebecca West to see Thomas Hardy. And Thomas Hardy was old at the time, and he just published a collection of poetry. And all the reviewers said he was so pessimistic and sad and dark and gloomy, and all these words. And Hardy said he did not understand. Hardy said, "Why? I thought they were really good and cheerful poems." And his wife said, "Oh dear, that's not what everybody thinks what hilarious is." So, and then Rebecca West came back and said, Mr. Hardy one of Mr. Hardy's families must have married a weeping willow before him. So I'm not a weeping willow, and I don't come from a weeping willow, but so I think I'm glad to take questions if you have questions.
Thank you.
Yeah.